Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we are less than a month away now from the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the American Revolutionary War, our War for Independence, which began in April of 1775, right outside of Lexington and Concord, which are just outside of Boston. In Massachusetts. So a lot of you have been recommending that I check out the new beginning of a series that apparently is going to be coming out in the weeks and months ahead from Epic History. This is the American Revolution Part 1, The Road to Rebellion. It's a 27-minute video, so buckle up. We're going to be here for a little while talking about this one. It's a topic I love to talk about. I've had the privilege of spending time at Lexington and Concord. And in Boston. It's a really cool place to visit if you are interested in history. There's a lot of history to be found there. So I'll put the link in the description so you can check it out without my commentary, as well as all of Epic History's other fantastic content. I will say up front that sometimes when I do reactions to Epic History, there are some issues related to the licensing with the music that they use. I use a music licensing service called Epidemic Sound, which is what a lot of content creators use. I don't know what service Epic History uses, but it's definitely one that I don't use because I often have issues like that. And so what YouTube will end up doing is actually muting some of the music if it's unlicensed and I don't have the license for it. So if you notice funny spots with the music in a couple of places during the video, it's probably related to that. Or as far as the sound goes, because sometimes when it mutes that music, it also muffles the sound a little bit. So just a heads up in case that is the case. Looking forward to diving into this one. I want to thank Josh from Mesa, Arizona. Thank you so much, Josh, for signing up as a patron just a few weeks ago. I really appreciate it. Let's dive in.
The 7 Years' War, a global conflict fought by European powers, is at an end.
And here's the funny thing, and I've talked about this some before. I don't really remember growing up here in Ohio ever hearing about the 7 Years' War. We may have, and I just don't remember it. But I remember vividly learning about the French and Indian War, which is basically just the North American component of the 7 Years' War. But it just goes to show you how, depending on where you live, how history gets taught and what is focused on.
And the British Empire has emerged victorious. Dominating its French and Spanish rivals, it claims new territory in India, the West Indies, and above all, North America.
Yep.
France must accept the loss of nearly all its colonies. 3 million square miles of land.
This war it's so underrated, and a lot of people talk about it being World War Zero. It's so underrated because, as we all know, that history is connected, and while it's not, I mean, there's obviously stuff that comes before it that leads to the 7 Years' War, but it's a really great starting point for looking at the chain of events that results in everything that happens for the next 250 years afterwards. You know, the dominoes start to fall from this war that lead to the American Revolution, that lead to the French Revolution, that lead to the wars of the coalitions with Napoleon, that lead to the revolutions of 1848, that lead to the Franco-Prussian War, that lead to World War I and World War II, and the Crimean War in there, and all the other things too.
Comparable in size to all Europe. The British now rule an empire on which the sun never sets. But in victory, the seeds of future conflict are sown. The enormous cost of the war has ballooned Britain's national debt. Interest payments alone consume more than half its annual spending.
Half its annual spending on interest. Think about that. It is not, and I'll say this till I'm blue in the face, I will die on this hill, it is not unreasonable for the British government to pass some of that cost onto the colonies that it was defending in a good bit of that war. Now, of course, the argument can be made, well, then the colonies should have had representation, but the British government would argue, well, you are represented in Parliament.
And the vast new territories in America will need defending from bitter imperial rivals who will look for any chance to reverse Britain's gains. Native American tribes also pose a threat, especially those that are former allies of the French.
Look at the map, and it's important to note, I know I'm talking a lot because we're like a minute and a half in and I'm going 3.5 minutes already, but right here, look at that. I mean, the Appalachian Mountain Range is the western border of the colonies. So much, we do ourselves a disservice when we think of, for example, Pennsylvania as having its modern borders in 1763 or in 1776, or Virginia or North Carolina or any of these places.
In 1763, Chief Pontiac of the Odawa leads a revolt against the British. There is bloodshed along the frontier as every British fort west of the Appalachians comes under attack. But the greatest challenge will come not from external enemies, but from the very colonies Britain seeks to protect.
By the way, can I just pause here and say how fantastic the narrator's voice is on these videos? He's perfect for it. I think so much of, just in general, I mean, their research is great, the animation's top-notch, the music, the narration, it all just works. It really does. It's really one of my favorite channels to watch. What then is the American, this new man? He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced. This is really, really important, because by the time you get to the 1760s, yes, we still have waves of immigration happening from the mainland of Britain. But by this point, Americans are a different breed than your typical Englishman. Living in the world where they live, with the vastly bigger territory that they have, more wide open spaces, living on frontiers, it's just different. And the sensibilities and the priorities and the values of people in the colonies are growing more and more apart from their cousins in England and Scotland and Ireland.
157 years have passed since the first British colony was founded in North America. Now, there are 26 British colonies in North America and the West Indies. 13 of these lie along America's eastern seaboard.
Great point. It's only half the
after
colonies.
Years of prosperity and immigration, the population has passed 2 million. Arguably, there is more that divides these 13 colonies than unites them.
That's true. I mean, in these 13, I mean, then you have Canada, and you have the West Indies, and you have, all of these other colonies. And there's so much. I mean, this war starts out as really a New England thing. And a lot of people in the South, places like Virginia and the Carolinas, they're like, it's not our war, it's not our problem, it's not our beef with the British.
Which has its own distinct character, history, and form of government.
Yeah.
Several were founded by those seeking religious freedom in the New World. The Puritans who settled Massachusetts, the Catholics of Maryland, and Quakers of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and very often, these groups, while wanting religious freedom for themselves, are also denying it to people who are different than them. So just because you're Quaker doesn't mean you're perfectly fine with Catholics and Lutherans. Just because you're Lutheran doesn't mean you're fine with Congregationalists, and so on and so forth.
Each colony has its share of rugged pioneers and economic opportunists, enticed by promises of plentiful land. But there are also many who arrive destitute, desperate, or against their will. slavery is legal in all 13 colonies. In the north, enslaved Africans are a small minority, about 5% of the population. But in the south, the economy is dominated by slave plantations that grow rice, tobacco, and indigo.
It's a great point that slavery as a uniquely Southern institution is developing by this point, but it's not 100% that way. I mean, let's look at some of these numbers. Let's look at the states that by 1860 are slave states. You're looking at Maryland, Delaware, and the ones to the south of that. But at this point, you've got 19,000 enslaved people in New York, 5,700 in Connecticut, 4,700 in Massachusetts.
In Virginia, African slaves make up around 40% of the population. In South Carolina, 60%.
And the majority of people coming in the slave trade are coming in through the port of Charleston, which is the most valuable piece of real estate in the colonies in terms of the wealth that is being generated in a port.
Early settlers had been overwhelmingly from England. But in recent decades, the picture has begun to change, with more immigrants from Ireland, Scotland, and Germany.
And these are going to especially be in the South, the Scots-Irish as they get called, and we've covered some of where that term comes from. But you see how there's Scots-Irish and then there's Scottish as kind of a separate thing, and you don't really see just plain Irish there. Most of what we call kind of a straight Irish immigrant is going to happen later on in the 19th century. These Scots-Irish are primarily from Ulster, which today we know as Northern Ireland. These are people who are Scottish by descent, who have settled in Ireland over the last couple hundred years. And a lot of them settle in places like the Carolinas, and that's why they're, again, going to have a very different view on government and on the war than some other places.
All have helped to shape a new American culture, which makes a sharp impression on visitors. It is less deferential, more enterprising, increasingly self-confident. Old ties with the motherland are not what they used to be.
Yeah, that's all so true.
For most of their history, the relationship between the British government and its American colonies has been one of salutary neglect. The colonies had been largely left to manage their own affairs.
Yep. And that's why when you do that for long enough, if you then crack down, that's why you get the knee-jerk reaction that in hindsight we look and think, man, the colonists kind of overreacted a little bit to all of this. And that's a fair assessment, but it makes more sense when you realize how long they've been left to do their own thing. If you have teenagers and you kind of just let them do their own thing and hang out in their room all hours of the day, and they come down and get food when they want, and they do their own laundry, and you kind of leave them alone, and then one day you say, I need you to get a job and start paying your own way, or I need you to start cooking dinner or doing the dishes after they've not had to do that for years, it's probably not going to go well.
While Britain focused on more lucrative possessions in the West Indies and India. But this is about to change. Britain faces an extraordinary debt crisis, and many expect the colonies to help meet the cost of their own defense. It seems a reasonable expectation. The average American's tax burden is a fraction of that paid by the average Briton.
Yep.
By one calculation, a Briton pays 26 shillings a year in tax. A New Englander, 1 shilling. But it is the manner in which the British government goes about raising taxes that will put it and the colonies on a collision course.
And I have to wonder in hindsight, because eventually the British government's pretty much going to be willing to do all the things the colonists demanded before the war broke out. But unfortunately, by the time you get to that point, the colonists say, it's too late. Now we're irrevocably on the road to independence. I have to wonder if the British government had been willing to do those things from the beginning, would this have all been avoided? If America looks to Great Britain for protection, she must enable us to protect her. If she expects our fleets, she must assist our revenue. That is a
British
fair
Prime Minister
point.
George Grenville is determined to fix the country's spiralling debt crisis. He believes new colonial taxes must be part of the solution. In 1764, he proposes 2 new revenue-raising measures. A Sugar Act, which actually lowers the tax on foreign sugar and molasses, but only as part of a determined effort to ensure more effective collection. And a Stamp Act, which will tax all commercial and legal documents, from newspapers and playing cards to attorneys' licenses and land grants. These relatively minor taxes are not expected to cause much fuss. Englishmen have been paying them for 70 years.
Yeah, this is an excellent point, that the British government was genuinely surprised when there was pushback to these taxes. They really did not expect it.
But to the surprise of the British government, the reaction in the colonies is uproar.
And again, think about this in context. Colonies are used to doing their own thing. Suddenly, the mother government steps in and starts saying, hey, we need you to pay your fair share. They haven't had to do that so far. So that's why it feels like oppression. It feels like, who are you to come and do this? You've never made us do this before. Why suddenly do you need to do it now?
Impact particularly hits merchants, lawyers, and business owners,
Paul Revere,
the most
a.k.a.
articulate
Jack Black.
and influential members of colonial society.
That's an excellent point, too. And, I don't think this gets stated enough. And I did see that Atten Shea just did a video on this topic, and I don't know if he covered these things or not, but at some point we'll take a look at it. The taxes in question and the things that are happening disproportionately affected the wealthier colonists. And it was among that class of people from which you're going to get the Continental Congress and the people who are the loudest voices in all of this. Your average farmer in the field isn't impacted to any great degree by this and really probably doesn't care all that much, at least at first.
They condemn the measures in newspapers and a flood of pamphlets.
This tax will deprive us of all our invaluable rights and privileges. It will drain us suddenly of our cash, occasion an entire stagnation of trade, discourage every kind of industry, and involve us in the most abject slavery.
Look at the way this is worded. And this is part of all of this. And listen, I don't want you to understand me to be saying that somehow I don't think there were valid arguments on the side of the colonists, or that I'm somehow not a patriotic American, because I absolutely am. I just think it's important, in order to have a full picture of all of this, to focus heavily on looking at this objectively and looking at this from the British side, because here in the United States, we've only ever been raised with the whole King George III was a tyrant, taxation without representation, oppressive taxes. We had every right to fight back. That's what we were raised hearing. But like everything in history, it's much more nuanced than that. But look at the wording of this. We're talking about 2 relatively minor taxes that really don't impact most people, and the people that are impacted by it are really not in any way severely inconvenienced by it. But it will deprive us of all our invaluable rights and privileges. It will drain us suddenly of our cash and occasion an entire stagnation of trade. It's going to destroy our economy, discourage every kind of industry, these taxes on paper and on sugar, and involve us in the most abject slavery. It's this same kind of wording when you're going to get things like the Boston Massacre and stuff like that.
Opposition focuses less on the financial burden than on the principle of consent.
There you go.
Americans.
This, I think, is probably the most valid argument that the American colonists are going to make in all of this.
Protest that they have no representation in the British Parliament, and can accept no taxation without representation. It is their rights as British subjects, they point out, rights protected by the British Constitution, that are being trampled on.
But if you are British subjects, then you're subject to the British government's taxes. So it works both ways.
Prime Minister George Grenville argues the American colonies have virtual representation in Parliament.
Right.
That is, their interests are represented in a general way by all British MPs.
Right.
After all, even most Britons don't have the right to vote in a general election.
That's an excellent point, too. Nor would most colonists have the right to vote when the United States becomes a nation. You're talking about a relatively select few wealthy male landowners. It's only in the mid-19th century that you're going to start to see much larger numbers of even male citizens in the British government have a right to vote. Like 1830s, 1840s is when a lot of these reforms are going to take place. So, interesting point.
Grenville's argument does not win many backers, even in Parliament itself, where electoral reform is a fierce battleground.
Right.
There is an idea, in some, that the colonies are virtually represented in the House. I would fain know by whom an American is represented here. Is he represented by any knight of the Shire in any county in this kingdom? Or will you tell him that he is represented by any representative of a borough? A borough which perhaps its own representatives never saw.
That's fair.
This is what is called the rotten part of the Constitution. It cannot continue a century.
The Speaker is Pitt the Elder, a renowned former Prime Minister, who adds
that this kingdom has no right to lay a tax upon the colonies.
What greater glory can New England see than stamp men hanging from a tree? This is how extreme this got and how quickly it got to where we're talking about things like tarring and feathering and actually stringing people up. And this happened on both sides, where people were being actually killed because they were on the wrong side of the issue in a particular place at a particular time.
Throughout 1765, colonial assemblies meet to protest against the new acts. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry emerges as one of the most radical leaders of colonial resistance.
I am pausing a lot, I know, but that's why you're here, right? Patrick Henry reminds me a lot of today's social media, where it's the most extreme voices that tend to get the airtime. And he's one of those people who's remembered because he says, give me liberty or give me death. Like, this is something I'm willing to fight and die for. And the stuff we saw earlier, the writing about, the really extreme things that are being said about this is what's getting people riled up.
He proposes a series of resolutions, which are adopted by the House.
Resolved, that the first adventurers and settlers of His Majesty's colony and dominion of Virginia brought with them all the liberties, privileges, and immunities that have at any time been held, enjoyed, and possessed by the people of Great Britain. Resolved, that the taxation of the people by themselves, or by persons chosen by themselves to represent them, is the only security against a burdensome taxation.
Again, I would question the idea that it's a burdensome taxation, but the argument to be made for wanting representation, I think, is a fair one.
But there are bitter divisions within the Virginia Assembly. Some members believe Patrick Henry goes too far. Loyalty to Britain and the British Crown is deep-rooted. Conservative members succeed in removing his most radical resolution, that only Virginia's assembly has the authority to raise taxes in the colony.
Yeah, and that, it's tough for me to say, we have all the rights of any Englishman, but then to say that only Virginia has the right to tax Virginia, as that would actually mean that you have rights that don't exist for the average Englishman. Because you don't get to say, for example, that only people in Northumberland can tax people in Northumberland. No, the government in London gets to make that decision for the whole of the country.
Among the regular observers at these debates, a brilliant 22-year-old law clerk named Thomas Jefferson.
Yep. 22.
The divisions in Virginia are mirrored across the colonies as debate grows more heated and protests turn violent. Tax collectors are beaten up by mobs, driven out of town, or forced to resign. Tax documents are destroyed. Effigies of royal governors are burned or hanged from liberty trees. Meanwhile, delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies meet in New York, where they draft a petition to the British King, George III, and Parliament.
And you don't hear much about the Stamp Act Congress. We tend to focus on this starting with the First Continental Congress, which is once we get into the 1770s, and then the Second Continental Congress, which is actually the one that will declare independence.
While assuring Crown and Parliament of their unwavering loyalty, the delegates declare that it is their right, as Englishmen, to have no taxes imposed upon them without their consent. Colonial merchants begin to organize a boycott of British goods.
And again, even in that writing you saw, they said, except by their respective legislatures. So what they're arguing for is already something unique. And this goes back to the idea that Americans are just built different, so to speak, that they have grown up largely removed from the British government and kind of doing their own thing. And they've had their own legislature. They've had, in Virginia, the House of Burgesses going back to the 1600s. And so it feels very natural to them to have their own say in that. But what they're asking for isn't the right of an Englishman. It's actually something unique compared to the average Englishman. And that's okay, but call it what it is.
The uproar, the possible damage to trade, plus the fact that taxes are clearly unenforceable, finally forces the British government to back down. The following year, 1766, the Sugar Act and Stamp Act are scrapped by a new British Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham. The colonies have won a major victory. But the British Parliament does not back down over its right to raise taxes in America.
And here's where you're going to begin to have, and it's interesting to note that there are multiple prime ministers over the years. We're on the second one already, and we're already going to be on to another one before this is all said and done. This is where you start to get escalation from one side to the other. It starts out with the colonists saying, hey, we just want our rights as Englishmen. We want to be Englishmen. We want to be part of the empire. And the British saying, yeah, then you need to submit. And then it starts to escalate a little bit at a time. And every time one side escalates, the other side responds with escalation of its own. There's nobody who's clean in all of this.
The same day it repeals the taxes, it declares,
Parliament assembled had, hath, and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America, in all cases whatsoever.
The words seem calculated to outrage America's colonial assemblies and convince many that though this storm has passed, another will surely follow.
That's a fair thing to think from that. Suppose a military force is sent into America. Oh, they'd never do that, right? They will not find a rebellion. They may indeed make one. That's so brilliant. Benjamin Franklin always had, he was really good at reading the room and having a good understanding no matter where he was. And this is so, it seems so prophetic when you think about what's going to happen less than a decade later, that the events that happen over the next coming years are going to build up to creating a rebellion that might not have otherwise happened.
1767. 1 year on, Parliament passes a new series of measures to raise revenue from the colonies and demonstrate its authority over them. They are named after the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Townshend Acts. In the 13 colonies, they are met with howls of protest.
So think about where we went. We went from sugar and the Stamp Act, which have been repealed, to now tax on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Customs Board established to enforce shipping regulations, reduce taxes on British East India Company tea. In other words, buy our stuff, you won't have to pay as much taxes on. It's essentially a tariff.
Royal administrators are chased out of towns. Some tax officials are tarred and feathered, a brutal punishment where the victim is paraded through the streets covered in scalding tar.
Yeah. Not just humiliating, painful.
A new term emerges for these rabble-rousers: patriots. Colonists who seek to avoid confrontation with Parliament
Tories
become known as loyalists.
Loyalists are Tories. The Tories are the party that prosecutes the war in North America, whereas the Whigs are the conservatives, or the Tories are the conservatives, I should say, and they're the ones who are prosecuting the war, and so people who are loyalists are eventually going to come to be known as Tories.
Many communities, and even families, will soon be divided between these two camps.
Yep, it's a civil
Though
war.
For now, most are somewhere in the middle. Among the patriots in New England are a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty.
They're terrorists. I mean, by our own definition today, if we were applying this to people in other places, we would call them terrorists.
Led by Samuel Adams, they include merchant and smuggler John Hancock, physician Joseph Warren, and silversmith Paul Revere. The crisis comes to a head in Massachusetts. Boston has been a hotbed of patriot activity since the Stamp Act, and tension rises when British soldiers are quartered here in 1768. On the 5th of March, 1770, an altercation between soldiers and locals turns into a tense standoff. Taunted by an angry crowd hundreds strong, pelted with snowballs and rocks, the small British detachment loses its nerve and opens fire.
This was eventually going to happen. The way things were escalating, the way the tensions are in Boston at this point, it was only a matter of time before this happened. You've got young British soldiers, thousands of miles from home, who are standing out front of the State House building and trying to protect it and trying to stand their ground and believe they are the rightful authority for the government. And they're carrying loaded weapons, and they're being taunted by an angry mob that's armed, many of them with clubs that are throwing not only snowballs but ice and rocks and taunting them and trying to egg them on. And who knows exactly how crazy this got. But eventually, a gunshot goes off, maybe by accident, maybe a nervous private who just thinks they're trying to protect themselves. And then once one shot goes off, several shots go off. The next thing you know, 5 people are dead. And it's spun as the murder of innocent civilians asserting their rights by a tyrannical British army.
Five local men are killed. The Boston Massacre, as it becomes known, is powerful propaganda for the patriot cause.
It's 100% what it was.
The news carried in pamphlets and prints the most famous created by Paul Revere. Blood has been spilt. Emotions are running high.
Let the 5th of March never be forgot,
Writes Bostonian Samuel Savage in his diary. Many anticipate a downward spiral into violence and disorder.
And yeah, so you've got the Sons of Liberty, who are kind of the extremists. And I used the word terrorists earlier. I don't want to imply that they're out there murdering, innocent people right and left. But they are causing destruction to property. They are making threats and using violence, things like that. But you also have more moderate voices who are no less committed to the cause, the patriot cause, but have a very different way of going about it. Guys like John Adams, who's Samuel Adams' cousin. And John Adams is going to defend the soldiers in the Boston Massacre case, not because he's not an ardent patriot or that he is in favor of British soldiers being quartered in Boston, but because he recognizes that if we're going to fight for a free and democratic society, that means the right to have a proper defense in court and have your case heard, even if you're a British soldier. The inhabitants are greatly enraged, and not without reason.
Despite the bloodshed in Boston, there are many on both sides who seek to de-escalate the crisis between British, Loyalists and Patriots. The British governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, withdraws the troops from Boston and has those involved in the shooting put on trial.
Yeah, and there are people trying to de-escalate, but it's also important to note that as both sides escalate this more and more, they're pushing people off the fence. Because, as the British government, for example, escalates by sending more troops and cracking down and putting Boston under martial law, as it's going to do later on, and introducing more and more measures like that, people who generally were sympathetic to the British government or just didn't care start to come off the fence. And likewise, people on the British government side who may have been sympathetic to the colonial point of view, they see things like what the Sons of Liberty are doing and things of that nature, and they start becoming increasingly belligerent toward the colonies.
They are acquitted of murder thanks to the efforts of their skilled lawyer, a noted patriot, John Adams.
And this is once again my opportunity to point out that if you've never seen the HBO series John Adams, you are missing out not only on an incredibly historically accurate, though not perfect, no TV show is, but a very historically accurate representation of some of the key people, and especially of John Adams, who was really, really super important in all of this time and brilliantly acted by Paul Giamatti.
In Britain, there is a new Prime Minister,
Lord North.
Lord North, a close friend of the King and staunch advocate of parliamentary authority.
And some people say, actually, a relative of the King, a very close relative of the King.
Serve in the role for the next 12 years. The economic damage of colonial boycotts persuades him to repeal Townshend's new taxes. All but one on tea.
Important note there. The tea, which is going to become the focus of the Boston Tea Party, is the only one left after the other ones have all been repealed.
Relative calm returns to the colonies. The boycott is lifted. A second crisis has been weathered. But in New England, hostility towards the British government lingers. Here, local merchants rely on ships and trade, and have long resented British imperial rules, which restrict their commerce with other nations. Many patriots, like John Hancock, make extra money by smuggling goods into the colonies, bypassing British import duties.
Again, the unspoken cause of the revolution: money. Money and land.
British efforts to clamp down on smuggling do not make them any more popular. Royal Navy warships are used to inspect and seize vessels belonging to prominent local figures, like John Hancock. To the outrage of New England merchants, the British also begin trying suspected smugglers in special Vice Admiralty courts, rather than the more sympathetic local courts.
And you can make a fair argument that, hey, a court that deals specifically with naval crimes is the one that should try this. But again, these are just escalations. And when you've got sides that already don't trust each other, anything you do, no matter how well-intentioned you think they might be, are going to just be seen as further evidence of why you can't trust the other side.
In 1772, the Sons of Liberty hit back, boarding the Royal Navy schooner HMS Gaspé and setting it ablaze. Meanwhile,
what do you do if you're the British government? Honest question. A organization that has its primary purpose to basically be to subvert your rule and your government and your authority has now burned a British vessel, has destroyed British government property. What do you do? Do you back down? Do you escalate? Do you do nothing? Are you seen as weak at that point? You have to respond somehow, right?
in Britain, the Empire's largest corporation is on the verge of bankruptcy. The East India Company has a monopoly on British trade with India, China, and the East Indies. But a credit crisis now threatens its survival.
Again, the unspoken cause. It's all about, and I know money is taxes, but not just taxes, money in general, and it's on both sides of the issue.
In 1773, to help keep the company afloat, Parliament grants it the right to sell tea directly to the American
They're
colonies.
too big to fail.
The company also receives tariff exemptions that will make its tea cheaper than that of the local smugglers. But a small tax of 3 pence per pound of tea remains in place.
It's not a new tax, it's just remaining in place. And you've adjusted the market in ways that make it to where the colonists are going to buy British tea and therefore pay the tax. And that's how they're going to see it.
The new Tea Act thus threatens the profits of local smugglers and provokes patriots on the principle of taxation without representation.
You're hitting John Hancock where it hurts.
As 7 company ships cross the Atlantic, packed with 250 tons of tea, the Sons of Liberty and others pressure tea dealers to reject the shipments. When one ship arrives in Philadelphia, thousands of locals threaten anyone who helps to unload its cargo.
And look, think about that for a second. Now you are threatening fellow colonists if they choose the wrong side. So you don't get to be loyal to the crown anymore. You either side with us or else. And this I've got a real problem with. If this whole movement is based on the idea of liberty, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, of freedom, then how are we going to tell other people, don't you dare side with our opponents in all of this? You have to take our side or else. That doesn't sit well with me in hindsight.
Most of the ships are forced to turn back. In Boston, however, Governor Thomas Hutchinson has had enough of boycotts. He ensures that 3 company ships enter the harbor. On a December evening in 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty board the ships, disguised as Native Americans. They've chosen these costumes as a symbol of their new American identity. They break open 340 chests of tea and dump the contents into the harbour. 92,000 pounds of tea in all, with a value today of nearly $2 million. Patriots celebrate the Boston Tea Party as a bold act of defiance. And it is just the most famous of several such acts in numerous ports and towns.
But why do we hear about that one? Well, it was not only the biggest, but it also happens in Boston, which is the epicenter of the revolution at this point.
According to Patriot lawyer John Adams,
this is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the Patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking.
So even more measured, careful, at this point anyway, John Adams is becoming increasingly hostile toward the British. And by the time you get to 1775 and 76, he's going to be one of the, if not the loudest voice for independence.
reaction in London is rather different. The British government sees only lawlessness, mob rule, and an outrageous attack on private property.
Yeah, I can see it that way too.
Enough is enough. If the government does not act firmly now, its authority in North America will lie in tatters.
Escalation.
The time for restraint is over. The gloves are coming off.
Okay, so I guess we're wrapping it up right there. Fantastic work as always from the folks at Epic History. I look forward to the next phase of this. Like I said, as I'm currently making this, it's middle of March of 2025. We're just a couple of weeks away from the 250th anniversary of the revolution. So I'm sure we'll be covering a lot more content related to these events. In the meantime, I want to thank Eric in South San Francisco, California, as well as Mark in Durham in the UK for your support on Patreon. I couldn't do it without you. Thanks for watching.